Hi everyone, so this is video number 8 and we are now starting the Romantic period, which is our final period of the 3 that we have to look at for the Concerto through time. And in today's lesson, the key learning points are going to be 1, looking at what the Romantic aesthetic or the Romantic style was and how this affected the musical features in classical music. So how compositions were different in the Romantic period to how they had been before, what the changes were in terms of the different elements of music and the different features that composers were using in their music so that it sounded romantic. And then the second thing we will look at is a bit of a focus on instruments and the instruments that generally were the soloists in the concerto and some of the things that they were doing. So I'm going to show you now this slide. Now, I didn't give you all of this information right at the start because I thought it might be a bit too overwhelming, but this is basically a breakdown of music and the styles right the way from the Baroque to the 20th century. And obviously we're not looking at the 20th century, which can be called 20th century modernism, but then you also had lots of other isms like impressionism, expressionism, serialism, minimalism, etc. You also had nationalism or the nationalistic music, which slightly overlaps with the end of the Romantic. But you've got your 3 key blocks there on the slide: the purple, blue and green, the Baroque period, the classical period, and then finally the Romantic period. And hopefully, looking at this now on lesson number 8, a lot of this information is actually already familiar to you and you've either remembered it or looking at it, it jogs a memory and you have retained some of that. I mean, that's the idea. So the Baroque period, as you can see, you've got the date 1600 to 1750. You've got 2 example composers, Vivaldi and Bach, but obviously there were lots of other ones. We did talk about Handel, we did talk about Corelli. You just need to pick one. You're never going to need to know more than one composer per period. So I would go for Bach because it begins with B-A. And you've got some adjectives beginning with E underneath each one. So for Baroque, you've got elaborate and explorative, and hopefully that sort of rings a bell. So underneath, I've just written a little paragraph. The music was elaborate, twiddly and complex, using ornaments and often polyphonic textures held together by the harpsichord and basso continuo. So the classical period came next. We've looked at Haydn and Mozart's influence, and they really were the 2 main classical composers. Haydn came first, then Mozart. I don't think we need to look at any others. Obviously, there were some, but they really were sort of leaders of the pack during that period. The 2 adjectives I chose for this are elegant and equal. I just like the idea of them all beginning with E, although that possibly is confusing because you've got to remember 6 adjectives that all begin with E. But that's the classical period, and underneath a little explanation: balanced, elegant and clear music that focused on primary harmony, cadences and patterns. Now, as you can see on the timeline, Beethoven was a composer at the end of the classical period, and his music very much transitioned the musical style and aesthetic into what became known as Romanticism. The Romantic period dates that we are going to have in mind is 1820 to 1900, and that's a nice easy cut-off because basically as soon as we get to the 20th century, things have changed. And I've given you 4 composers' names. They're not in any order, for any reason: Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Elgar and Rachmaninoff. Now, you might have heard of Brahms, you might have heard of Elgar. I assume you have heard of Tchaikovsky. He wrote The Nutcracker, Swan Lake, he wrote famous ballets, so a lot of people have heard of Tchaikovsky. But he wasn't necessarily by any means sort of the most prolific or the most important Romantic composer. There were actually lots of very successful Romantic composers. So I've given you 4 names, but there were dozens of really, really great ones who were very well known during the time and since. And the 2 adjectives that I've put under that are emotional and expressive. So as it says, Romantic music is highly expressive music which reached for extremes in all elements to convey the human emotion and drama. So this leads us on to learning point number 1. What was the Romantic aesthetic? So in the same way that in the middle of the 18th century it became fashionable to enjoy or emulate classicism, in the early to mid 19th century, it became popular or fashionable to become more and more romantic. So the word romantic probably triggers in you the idea of a romantic love, and therefore sort of happy emotions and a happy expression. But actually it was much wider than that. It was much broader. So it was a range of emotions. So you could have anger, fear, rage. Everything was very sensationalized. Everything was very dramatic. And a key theme that ran through a lot of music was death and destiny. You did have romantic love. So love was a theme that was very important. You also had sort of slightly contrasting themes about the world. So music that was being written about nature also became quite important, but all of the music was dramatic. So even music that was written about nature and to describe nature would have dramatic scenes. You know, you'd have a thunderstorm and it would be very over the top and lots of crashing and banging of timpanis and cymbals and stuff. So everything was dramatic, everything was over the top, everything was extreme, everything was expressive, and just got more so and more so throughout that period. So I'm now playing you an extract of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto number 1. And you can see we've got a massive orchestra with a conductor at the front, and our soloist is about to come in with the main theme. And what we see is immediately is how melody is used in the Romantic period to create drama. And what we see here is a very wide range of melody. So the pianist is playing very low notes, then in the middle of the piano, and then right up to the top. So extremes of pitch, either high or low, and a very wide melodic range was a crucial way of being expressive with your melody. It's also expressive and emotional sounding, because we've got really creative and expressive use of articulation and dynamics. So we've got swells and dynamics from quiet to loud and back again, but we've also got very subtle changes in articulation. So we just had some pizzicato and very quiet strings, and then the pianos come back in with quite accented, expressive chords. And you can hear the piano over the rest of the orchestra. So the scoring is really light in the orchestra so that the piano can really be heard at this point. Now what I want you to try and do is keep in time. Try and tap your foot. And hopefully you've really struggled with that. And the reason for that is that in Romantic music, a key musical feature that helped make it emotional and expressive was bending the tempo. And the word they use for that in Italian is rubato. So Romantic music used rubato all the time. It sped up when it wanted to get more exciting, wanted to get more dramatic, but then also you would slow down at moments of tension or poignancy. And as you built up to a climax, so the tempo almost completely stopped then. And now she's building up again, coming crashing down. And right the way up again. So the full range of the piano. Jumping between low and high pitches. And the rest of the orchestra coming back in again. So in terms of structures, Romantic music did use similar structures that we'd had before. But composers were much more individual with them. So if they wanted to have changes to the more longer sections, then they could sort of play about with it. So here we can hear the main theme has come back and it's recognisable, but there's been lots of different changing moods and musical material in between that, including quite a lengthy period where the pianist was playing as a complete solo, but now the orchestra is playing all together. And the harmony in Romantic music was very expressive. So rather than just using primary harmony, you had a full range of chords and also lots of chromatic chords, which means chords with extra added sort of jazzy sounding notes, so sevenths and ninths and elevenths. Hopefully you can hear that, particularly in the piano part when she does these short little motifs. There's a lot of sort of melodic chromatic movement, but also we use that term chromatic to describe chords with lots of extra notes in them. And now we've got French horns, alternating with pizzicato strings. So in terms of instrumentation, you can see that there is a very large orchestra. But what was interesting in the Romantic period, that whilst the soloist was very important, you also had lots of periods in the music where instruments within the orchestra or instrument families within the orchestra would have little solos. That was something that didn't really exist beforehand. Now the pianist has got the solo again. And again, rubato, she's really slowed it down. And quite a changing mood. We've got the brass instruments, we've got trumpets there. And we're still within the same part of the piece, we're still in movement 1 of this concerto, but it's very, very different sounding. And now we've got this chromatic piano movement coming in again, quite sort of frenetic. And there's lots of interplay between the soloist and the rest of the orchestra. And so in these sections, as you can see, like before, when the piano solo has to be the most audible, the rest of the orchestra is quite light. So dynamics are light, the strings are often pizzicato, and not too many instruments are playing. So there's a flute and a clarinet alternating little solo passages with the piano. Lots of interplay between all the different instruments. And hopefully you can see and appreciate that what the pianist is playing is incredibly difficult. So all the way through the concertos, really, the solo parts would be difficult. If you remember back in the Baroque period, some of the things that the soloists had to play were really challenging. But the Romantic period really took that to a new level. So the soloist is very virtuosic and has very challenging solo passages throughout, and also would be expected to do it all from memory. So she's got no music in front of her, she's learned all of this off by heart. Got the clarinets again. Very low pitch on the piano. Those are bassoons next to the clarinets. The oboe is also playing, but you just can't see them. So a nice little woodwind interlude whilst the pianist has a rest, and now she's back in. And that's a very similar theme to the main theme, but it's sort of been altered and varied. So Romantic music just moved through all these different moods and ideas, but there were linking motifs and ideas between them, but composers really could play around with those connections between different parts of the music. And just think how emotional this is, how expressive it is. Those are violas. Cello's a pizzicato, very gentle sound. Lots of swells in dynamics, so it sounds emotional. Leaning on lots of notes. There's an oboe. Just think how many notes, the frequency of notes that the piano is playing. Full range of the instrument all the way up. Lots of chromatic harmony, lots of complex chords. building up tension, drama. Got timpani rolls. Just a moment ago it was quite calm. We've now got these accented, very loud chords and very dramatic music by the soloist. Slowing down. And getting quieter. Very different mood now. You'll see that the string instruments particularly are using a lot of vibrato, so the notes are very resonant, very pretty, very singing. We've got a flute solo, or the two flutes are playing a prominent solo at a high pitch. The piano in the background is playing lots of oscillating, quick-moving notes. So again, you hear that sort of scrunchy, soft, pretty-sounding harmony. It's not just as straightforward as using chord 1, 4 and 5. And we're moving through different keys quite rapidly as well during this section. We've got interplay between the clarinetist and I think bassoon, and then also the strings. So passing around lots of ideas. So the whole orchestra is really involved very heavily. When the soloist does perform, they're definitely centre stage, literally, and in terms of what you can hear. In terms of our remaining letters on our MAD t-shirt, mnemonic, in terms of rhythms, there wasn't anything particularly specific that we need to know about this. The main thing that is to do with time generally is the use of rubato. So you can see here that we're speeding up as things are getting more dramatic. The composer is the conductor is pushing the instruments forward, the tempo is speeding up, and you've got the timpani drums being banged at the back that are really helping drive it forward and create that drama. But within rhythm itself, you know, you might have dotted rhythm, straight rhythm, syncopation, but you would have perhaps more of a varied rhythmic types within one piece because you so often had a changing mood. You might also have irregular time signatures, so a regular number of beats in the bar. You have lots of pauses as well, which disrupts the flow of the music rhythmically. But the biggest influence really is the rubato. So just think about how contrasting that is, that section now, how quiet and slow. We just had a really dramatic moment before. Very complex harmony there, moving through lots of different keys. These sections as well, where the soloist is entirely on their own, are called cadenzas. And they did start in the classical period, but they would only ever happen at the end of a piece, and it was sort of just a little showy off extended solo passage at the end for the soloist. Whereas in romantic concertos, the composers would write cadenzas into the music. Timpani roll. So that isn't improvised, it sounds kind of improvised and all over the place and explorative, but it is written out, and it would just give the soloist little moments to really show off what they could do. So the final one is texture. You'll see it's very difficult to kind of assess what the texture is at any one point because there is just so much going on. The main thing is that the texture was varying and changing. So sometimes you would have a soloist, so a monophonic texture. Sometimes you would have imitation and little ideas being passed around throughout the orchestra, or overlapping, so polyphony. And then often you've got a chordal texture, even though it's complex. So that's homophonic at the moment. Everyone's playing stab chords and then different brass instruments are taking the main tune over the top, the main melody. So texture was very varied. So everything is being pushed to the max. Everything is being as dramatic as it possibly can be. Okay, so the second learning point for today was just to focus in on the romantic concerto soloists and what those instruments typically were and their roles. So obviously you've just watched a lengthy bit of video demonstrating a piano soloist, and you've seen how that soloist has to interact with the rest of the orchestra, how important they are, but that equally individual instruments and instrumental families had solos and solo passages within the piece, and there was a lot of interplay, there was imitation, and there were parts of it where the soloist was almost in a sort of accompanying role. So if you remember that bit where the piano was playing sort of oscillating up and down, quite quiet piano music, but then you had, I think it was the clarinet and the bassoon doing a kind of solo bit, sort of taking it in turns. And then there were some sections where the flutes were quite prominent, generally quite a lot of woodwind prominence in that piece, more so than brass. But yeah, so that's hopefully given you an idea. But what is important is that you recognise that there were three instruments that very much dominated this genre of romantic concertos, and that is pianos, cellos, and violins. So you had violin concertos right the way through from the Baroque. They were very popular. In the Baroque, as we know, we also had concerti grossi, so we would have a group of soloists, and sometimes that would be two violins or two violins and a cello, three violins even. We looked at the Bach Brandenburg Concerti Grossi. There are 6 of them, and they've all got different combinations of instruments. You could have woodwind soloists, although obviously not clarinets because they weren't invented, but you could have flute soloists, recorder soloists, and we looked at that example where you had 2 recorders playing with a violin, and when the recorders had solos, they actually generally played together because that sort of gave them more prominence in terms of how loud they were. But yeah, you could have a bassoonist and you could have brass instruments in your concertino in a Baroque concerti grossi, in a Baroque concerto grosso. In the classical period, violins continued to be popular instruments for being the soloist at the front. Now, as we know, we no longer had a group of soloists, so it was only one. So you could have a solo violin, a solo cello, you could have woodwind instruments playing solos, so you would have flute concertos in the classical period, oboe concertos, clarinet concertos were popular, particularly because it was a new instrument, so it was sort of innovative. Bassoon concertos technically existed but weren't as popular because the bassoon generally, because of its lower pitch, is an accompanying instrument. It can't be heard as well over the top of the rest of an accompanying orchestra. And you also had trumpet concertos and horn concertos, and you saw an example of those in video 6, I think, the one where you were appraising instruments and the different sounds of instruments. So yeah, quite a broad range in the classical period of which instrument could be the soloist. So in the Romantic period, interestingly, everything else was sort of expanding and going to extremes. So you might think, okay, well, what could be any instrument? You know, we can have a timpani at the front being the soloist, because we've got this massive orchestra, we've got an influx of instruments, we've also got new instruments, and that's something I'm going to touch on in a minute, so new additions to the orchestra. But however, what was stylish was actually just to focus on one of 3 choices, so a piano, a cello, or a violin. And there are very few examples of romantic concertos with other instruments at the front. So that was just the way it was, and I would be very surprised if OCR gave you an example of a romantic concerto that had a different instrument, so had a flute as the soloist or an oboe as the soloist. They did exist. Certain composers wrote for different instruments that they liked. I do know of some romantic trombone concertos, but they were very rare in comparison to a massive amount of piano, cello and violin solo concertos that were being written at that time. In terms of the new instruments in the orchestra, I did briefly touch on this in video 6 when we looked in more detail at the orchestra in the classical period. So it expanded in the classical period. We know that we got larger forces of instruments. We know that we had the addition of the clarinet, and the brass section increased as well. And so in the classical period, we had an orchestra where we had our larger string families. We had within the woodwind family 4 key instruments, so flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons. And in the brass family, we had 3 key instruments, trumpets, trombones and French horns. And then we also had eventually the addition of tubas. And we were seeing more use of timpani. You could also get a harp in the classical period, and sometimes you could also have a piano depending on the composer. You did have piano concertos as well in the classical period, so you might have a piano as your soloist. Mozart wrote quite a few famous piano concertos, and he's classical, obviously. But in the romantic orchestra, everything got larger once again. So the string families increased, and it was much more common to have harps. So you might not have one, you could have more than one. The percussion family increased dramatically, particularly towards the end of the romantic period and into the 20th century. So you would have a really large percussion section, which is always at the back of the orchestra and normally raised up. So as well as timpani, you would have a range of different drums. You would have tuned percussion instruments as well. So things like glockenspiels, xylophones. You would have cymbals, gongs, triangles, rattles, all sorts of different things depending on the piece. And within the woodwind family, you had some new instruments being introduced. So in terms of the flutes, you would have a piccolo, which is a small version of a flute that has a much higher register. And obviously that helped with this whole new craze for having melodies that used extremes of pitch. For the oboes, you would have something called a cor anglais, which is the French for an English horn. And that is basically the equivalent of a bass oboe. So it is a larger instrument. It has an interesting bell at the bottom that's kind of in a sphere shape, and it also has a crook mouthpiece, so it's still a double reed, but rather than the double reed going straight into the top of the cor anglais, it goes onto a metal crook, which is not dissimilar to the metal crook that sticks out of a bassoon. In terms of bassoons, you would have a contrabassoon, which is like a bass bassoon, which is much lower, so it plays an octave lower and then goes right down very, very deep. The contrabassoon again really helped to widen the breadth of pitch range in the music. And finally, with clarinets, you could also have a bass clarinet, which is an instrument that I guess has some similarities, I suppose, with the saxophone in terms of the mouthpiece. It's kind of on an extended, curved bit at the top of the instrument. You do also have clarinets in different keys, but you always had that, and that's not something you need to really worry about at GCSE. So you can get clarinets in clarinets in A, which are slightly smaller and tuned slightly differently. And the brass family would also increased in size. We didn't get new instruments on top of those 4, but you would just have more players generally and more sort of active brass writing within the orchestral score. So overall, everything was growing, everything was expanding, getting bigger and being dramatic. So you had a much wider range of timbres and types of sound, a much wider range of pitch. Instruments were being made to a much higher standard. So that was why they were able to do these subtle changes in dynamics, gradual dynamic changes, so swells where you're gradually getting louder over a period of time. So with woodwind and brass instruments, that's because you're applying gradually more pressure or increasing the flow of air through the instrument, and the instruments responded to that. The mechanisms in place were such that the sound could increase or obviously decrease if you did the opposite. So you had more dynamic variety, pitch variety, and obviously these very contrasting timbres within all the different families of instruments and the types of instruments at your disposal. But you need to remember piano, cello and violin for being the chosen soloists. They just were. That was just what was popular. There are some composers who were more known for writing for specific soloists than others. So Tchaikovsky is quite a good one to remember really for the Romantic period, because he wrote piano and cello and violin concertos, particularly violin concertos he was well known for. Cello, so there's a very famous cello concerto written by Dvorak, and also another one that's very well known written by Elgar. So if you heard a cello concerto on your exam and you were asked to name a composer, then Elgar and Dvorak are very renowned for their cello concertos. Dvorak is a later Romantic composer, but still Romantic nonetheless. It's really up to you. Rachmaninoff wrote some very famous piano concertos, but also violin concertos, and Brahms wrote for all three instruments, I believe. So generally speaking, you aren't going to be penalised if you pick a composer who wasn't as well known for writing for a particular instrument. Most of them all wrote for all three, and I don't think the exam board is going to sort of disqualify an answer if it wasn't the most popular choice.